Hey guys, tonight we peel back the ermine robes and jewel-encrusted facade of Tudor majesty to confront a far grimmer, more visceral reality. Imagine yourself stepping not into the grand public halls of Hampton Court or Whitehall Palace, but into the private, increasingly fetid chambers of an aging king. The air is heavy, not with the scent of incense or roasting meats from a royal feast, but with something cloying, something that speaks of decay and sickness, a smell that even the most perfumed handkerchiefs of the courtiers cannot fully mask. This is the antechamber to the suffering of Henry VIII in his final years, a monarch once the vibrant epitome of Renaissance kingship, now a prisoner in his own decaying body, a potent symbol of how even absolute power ultimately bows to the frailties of the flesh. Tonight, our journey takes us into the heart of this decline, to witness the grotesque death promised by our title. We will explore the agonizing physical ailments, the dubious medical treatments, the mental anguish, and the truly shocking, almost unbelievable indignities that marked the end of one of history's most formidable and feared rulers. This isn't the Henry of heroic portraits, nor the lusty king of popular imagination. This is a man confronting his own gruesome mortality. The reality check for tonight? The end of Henry VIII's life was a catalogue of horrors that would test the strongest stomach and the most resilient modern mind. The details of his physical decay, the state of his body even before death, and the bizarre, humiliating events that followed his final breath are rarely told in their full, repugnant detail in mainstream history books. They are too unsettling, too gory. But here, we don't shy away from the uncomfortable truths that history often tries to sanitize. You might think you know Henry VIII, the king of 6 wives and the English Reformation, but the story of his end reveals a vulnerability and a level of physical degradation that is truly shocking. So, before you get comfortable, before we delve into this tale of royal rot and historical horror, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a profound experience to connect with our global community of those who find a strange comfort in the darker, more detailed corners of the past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are about to explore the agonizing final chapter of Henry Tudor, a story that involves not just a leaking coffin, but yes, as the title grimly teases, the almost unbelievable detail of stray dogs lapping at the seeping fluids of a deceased king. It's a narrative that strips away all pretense of majesty, revealing the raw, often disgusting truth of human mortality, even for a king who considered himself little less than a god on earth. Prepare for a deep dive into the grotesque. To truly appreciate the depths of Henry VIII's later suffering and the ignominy of his end, you must first cast your mind back to a time when he was the very image of princely perfection, the golden boy of European royalty. Imagine the year 1509. A young man of just 17, almost 18, ascends the English throne. This isn't the bloated, irascible tyrant of later infamy. This is a figure of dazzling promise. Contemporary accounts, even from a Venetian ambassador not easily impressed, paint a picture of almost mythical allure. You see him, tall, well over 6 feet, a powerful athletic build honed by a passion for hunting, jousting, tennis, and all manly sports. His complexion is fair, his hair a vibrant golden red, his features angelic. He is learned, a musician, a theologian, at least in his own estimation, fluent in several languages, and possessed of an undeniable charisma. This young Henry is the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, the great hope of England. For the first 2 decades of his reign, this image largely holds. He is energetic, involved in the affairs of state, a patron of the arts, and a figure of European consequence. He marries Catherine of Aragon, his elder brother's widow, and for a time, the court is one of brilliance and festivity. But even in these golden years, perhaps the seeds of his later physical and temperamental decline were subtly being sown. His love for rich food and drink, his penchant for extravagant feasts, while typical of monarchs of the age, would later contribute to his immense weight gain. His passionate, often impulsive nature, while initially seen as vigorous, could also curdle into something darker with age and frustration. The shocking secret, or rather the pivotal moment that many historians point to as the beginning of his irreversible physical decline, occurs much later, in January 1536. Henry, now a man of 44, still robust, but perhaps no longer in the peak athletic condition of his youth, is participating in a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. Jousting was his passion, a display of martial prowess and kingly valor. But on this fateful day, disaster strikes. His fully armored horse, also in heavy barding, stumbles and falls, crushing the king beneath its immense weight. Henry, also in full plate armor, is trapped, unconscious, for a horrifying 2 hours. You can imagine the panic at court, the whispered fears that the king might die. He survives, but he is never the same again. The most significant injury is to his right leg. Some sources say both legs were affected over time, but one was primary. This wound, likely a severe compound fracture or a deep contusion that damaged the underlying bone and circulation, would never fully heal. It would become the bane of his existence, a constant source of agonizing pain, and, as we will see, a focal point for the grotesque physical decay that characterized his later years. One quirky, though tragic detail often debated by historians is whether this fall also caused a brain injury. Some suggest that the period of unconsciousness, combined with the trauma, might have exacerbated existing personality traits, contributing to the increased paranoia, irritability, and tyrannical rages that became so prominent in the latter half of his reign. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, this accident occurs around the same period as his momentous break with the Church of Rome and his decision to execute his second wife, Anne Boleyn. The Golden Prince is beginning his slow, inexorable transformation into a figure of fear and suffering, the seeds of his grotesque end now firmly planted in his own wounded flesh. You are now witnessing Henry VIII in the years following his debilitating jousting accident. His mobility is increasingly compromised by the festering wound on his leg. The athletic pursuits that once defined his vigorous youth, the hunting, the jousting, the tennis, are now largely impossible, or at least severely curtailed. Yet one royal pastime, one kingly indulgence, not only continues but seems to escalate: his prodigious appetite. The shocking secret of Henry's diet is not just its extravagance, but its sheer, artery-clogging, health-destroying volume and composition, a daily feast that propelled him relentlessly towards obesity and a host of related ailments. Imagine the royal kitchens at Greenwich, Hampton Court, or Whitehall. They are vast, bustling hives of activity, employing hundreds of cooks, scullions, spit-turners, and bakers. The amount of food prepared daily is staggering, even by the standards of a royal court. And at the center of this culinary largesse is the king's own table. Records from the royal household, such as the Eltham ordinances and analyses of kitchen accounts, give us a glimpse into what Henry consumed. Prepare yourself, because it's a menu that would make a modern cardiologist weep. Estimates suggest his daily caloric intake often hovered around 5,000 calories, sometimes more than double what an active man today might require. The cornerstone of this diet was meat, mountains of it. Roasted, boiled, stewed, baked into pies. You see vast joints of beef, haunches of venison. Henry was still a keen hunter in his earlier years, and game was plentiful. Swans, peacocks, often redressed in their feathers for spectacular presentation, cranes, herons, rabbits, and all manner of fowl. Pork, in various forms, was also a staple. Fish, of course, was consumed, especially on fast days, but it was the red meat, rich and fatty, that dominated his plate. The medical hardship of such a diet, even without our modern understanding of cholesterol and saturated fats, was beginning to be dimly perceived by some, but royal tradition and personal preference held sway. Vegetables and fruits, while available, played a distinctly secondary role, often viewed with suspicion or considered peasant food. You might see a few token root vegetables or some stewed fruit, but the emphasis was overwhelmingly on protein and fat. Bread, of course, was a staple, but it was typically fine white bread, manchet bread for the king, not the coarse, fiber-rich loaves of the common folk. And to wash all this down, impressive quantities of ale and wine, not the weaker, small beer drunk by many for hydration, but strong ales and fine imported wines from France and the Rhine. Gallons per day were not uncommon for the royal household, and the king himself was no abstainer. One quirky, or rather telling detail is that despite his evident gluttony, Henry, in his youth and even into middle age, was known for his fastidiousness about his food. He was concerned about freshness and quality, and, as we'll see, developed an increasing paranoia about poisoning. But this concern for quality did not translate into a concern for balance or moderation. The scholarly debate often considers whether his eating habits were a form of compensation for his declining physical abilities and chronic pain, a way to assert his power and enjoyment of life when other pleasures were fading. Or was it simply the expected indulgence of a powerful Renaissance monarch, a display of wealth and magnanimity? Whatever the reasons, the consequences were inevitable. The once athletic frame began to bloat. His waistline, recorded as a trim 35 inches in his youth, expanded dramatically. By his later years, it was reportedly well over 50 inches. His weight soared, eventually exceeding 180 kilograms, nearly 400 pounds. This extreme obesity exacerbated his existing leg problems, put immense strain on his heart, and contributed to a host of other ailments like gout and likely type 2 diabetes. The royal diet, a symbol of his power and privilege, was, in a very real sense, slowly but surely killing him, transforming the Golden Prince into the obese tyrant of his later years, a gory history written in calories and cholesterol. The jousting accident of 1536 was more than just a temporary setback for Henry VIII. It was the beginning of a lifelong medical torment, a gory secret that quite literally stank to high heaven and contributed significantly to his misery and perhaps even his infamous temper. The severe injury to his leg, or possibly both legs over time, refused to heal properly. Instead, it degenerated into chronic, suppurating varicose ulcers, open weeping sores that would plague him for the rest of his days, a constant source of agonizing pain and profound humiliation for a king obsessed with his own image and majesty. Imagine the scene in Henry's private chambers. You, as an attendant or physician, approach the royal presence, and even before you see him, you are assailed by an almost unbearable odor. This is the fetid stench of his leg ulcers, a combination of decaying flesh, infected pus, and the various pungent ointments and poultices applied in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to promote healing. Contemporary accounts, though often couched in careful language, leave little doubt about the severity and foulness of these wounds. Courtiers, even his own wives, would have had to endure this nauseating smell daily, their faces carefully composed to show no sign of revulsion, lest they incur the wrath of the increasingly irascible and sensitive king. You can picture them, subtly holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, a desperate defense against the royal miasma. The medical hardship for Henry was constant and multifaceted. The ulcers themselves would have been excruciatingly painful. Varicose ulcers, common in individuals with poor circulation and often exacerbated by obesity and immobility, all of which Henry suffered from, are notoriously difficult to heal, even with modern medicine. In the 16th century, with no understanding of infection control or effective wound care, they were a running nightmare. You see his physicians, a succession of increasingly desperate men, trying every remedy known to them. They would cleanse the wounds, perhaps with wine or vinegar, and apply an astonishing array of topical treatments, some based on traditional herbal lore, others on more dubious alchemical principles. Ointments containing honey, which has some antibacterial properties, might offer slight relief, but others containing heavy metals like lead or mercury were likely actively harmful. The ulcers would periodically flare up, becoming more inflamed, swollen, and painful, sometimes preventing the king from walking or even standing for extended periods. This immobility, of course, only worsened his obesity and overall health, creating a vicious cycle. There are accounts of the king roaring in agony during these episodes, his legendary temper fueled by constant, grinding pain. The scholarly debate often considers how much this chronic pain contributed to his increasingly tyrannical behavior in his later reign. The paranoia, the rages, the willingness to send even close advisors to the executioner's block on flimsy pretexts. Could a man in constant debilitating pain maintain a balanced judgment or a compassionate demeanor? One quirky, or rather, horrifyingly graphic detail that emerges from some historical interpretations is that the ulcers eventually became so deep and destructive that the underlying bone may have become exposed, a condition known as osteomyelitis, bone infection, which would have been untreatable and agonizing. The shocking secret is the sheer unvarnished reality of a powerful Renaissance monarch. A man who considered himself God's chosen representative on earth, being slowly consumed by his own putrefying flesh, his royal presence announced not by trumpets, but by the inescapable stench of his own decay. This was Henry's gilded cage of rot, a daily humiliating reminder of his own mortality, long before death finally claimed him. You are now deep within the increasingly suffocating and pain-filled world of Henry VIII's later years. His leg ulcers are a constant torment, his obesity a crushing burden, his temper a source of terror for the entire court. In this desperate situation, the king, and those around him, turned to the only recourse available, the physicians of the 16th century. But the shocking secret you uncover is that their cures, by modern standards, often constituted a form of unintentional medical torture. Treatments born of ignorance and ancient theory that likely did more harm than good, adding to the king's already considerable medical hardship. Imagine Henry, roaring in pain from his festering leg. His team of royal physicians, learned men for their time, versed in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, gather to consult. Their understanding of disease is based on the ancient concept of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they believe, arises from an imbalance of these humors. So their primary goal is to restore that balance, often through aggressive, debilitating interventions. You, observing their methods, would be horrified by the disconnect between their confident pronouncements and the suffering their treatments inflicted. One of the most common and revered treatments for almost any ailment, from fever to inflammation to a bad mood, was bloodletting. You see the physician, or perhaps a barber surgeon, summoned for the task, making an incision in one of Henry's veins, often in the arm, and allowing a significant quantity of blood to drain into a bowl. The theory was that this would remove excess or corrupted blood, thereby reducing fever or inflammation. In reality, for a man already weakened by chronic infection, obesity, and likely heart problems, repeated bloodletting would only further deplete his strength, contribute to anemia, and potentially hasten his decline. Yet it was done regularly, a ritual of medical orthodoxy. For the leg ulcers themselves, the treatments were often brutal. Cauterization, the burning of tissue with a red-hot iron, was a common method to try and stop bleeding, cleanse a wound, or prevent the spread of putrefaction. You can only imagine the searing agony of such a procedure performed without effective anesthesia, the smell of burning flesh adding to the already fetid atmosphere of the king's chambers. Even if it momentarily sealed a blood vessel, the extensive tissue damage caused by the burn would create an even larger area prone to infection. It was a cure that often paved the way for worse suffering. Then there were the myriad ointments, poultices, and potions applied to the ulcers or taken internally. Some might have contained relatively benign herbal ingredients, perhaps offering some slight soothing effect. But many others, as we've touched upon, included highly toxic substances like mercury, arsenic, or lead. These heavy metals, absorbed through the skin or ingested, would have had devastating cumulative effects on Henry's already compromised system, potentially contributing to kidney damage, neurological problems, and further weakening his constitution. One quirky, or rather alarming detail, is that physicians often judged the efficacy of a treatment by the violence of the body's reaction. Profuse sweating, vomiting, or diarrhea were sometimes seen as signs that the bad humors were being expelled, even if these reactions were actually symptoms of poisoning or systemic distress. The scholarly debate often explores whether Henry's physicians were charlatans or simply men doing their best with the limited and often dangerously flawed medical knowledge of their era. The consensus is largely the latter. They were highly educated, but their education was based on theories that had little connection to the true workings of the human body. The gory history of 16th century medicine is not one of deliberate malice, but of well-intentioned ignorance, leading to horrific outcomes. For Henry VIII, these cures were just another layer of his suffering, his human endurance, tested not only by his diseases but also by the very hands that sought to heal him. The relentless progression of Henry VIII's ailments, fueled by his gargantuan appetite and exacerbated by his festering leg ulcers, led to another shocking secret that profoundly impacted his reign and his personal dignity: his descent into extreme, debilitating obesity. The once athletic Golden Prince transformed, in his later years, into a literal mountain of flesh, a man so enormous that his own body became his most oppressive prison, subjecting him to constant medical hardship and daily indignities. You witness this slow, horrifying transformation. The king, who once gloried in his physical prowess, now struggles with even the simplest movements. His recorded waistline, as we've noted, ballooned from a youthful 35 inches to a staggering 52, 54, or even more by some accounts, before his death. His weight is estimated to have exceeded 180 kilograms, or nearly 400 pounds, possibly even more. Imagine the sheer physical mass, the strain on his already weakened legs, the pressure on his internal organs. Every step, if he could take one, would have been an agonizing effort. As his immobility increased, special measures had to be taken. You see his attendants struggling to help him rise from his bed or his chair. Eventually, even this becomes too difficult. Contemporary accounts and household records suggest that Henry, in his final years, had to be moved around his palaces using a kind of rudimentary pulley system or a machine, essentially a wheeled chair or litter that could be hoisted or winched to transport his immense bulk from one apartment to another. The very doorways and passageways in his favorite palaces, like Hampton Court and Whitehall, reportedly had to be widened to accommodate his passage. There's a profound, almost grotesque irony here. A king whose power reshaped a nation, yet who could not even navigate his own home without mechanical assistance and architectural modification. This immobility, of course, created a vicious cycle. Lack of exercise worsened his obesity, which in turn put more strain on his ulcerated legs, increasing his pain and further limiting his movement. It also contributed to poor circulation, muscle atrophy, and likely a host of other health problems, from sleep apnea, imagine the thunderous snores echoing through the royal bedchamber, to an increased risk of blood clots. The human endurance required to simply exist in such a state, to bear the constant discomfort, the chafing, the pressure sores, the sheer physical effort of breathing and being, is difficult to fathom. One quirky yet deeply sad detail is how this physical decline impacted his public image and his own famously inflated ego. Henry had always been acutely aware of his kingly majesty, his imperial stature. To be reduced to such a state of helpless corpulence must have been a devastating psychological blow. While court artists were undoubtedly instructed to portray him in a more flattering, powerful light in official portraits, the reality of his appearance could not be entirely hidden from those around him. The shocking secret of his later years was this profound disconnect between the idealized image of the mighty king and the grotesque reality of the suffering, immobilized man. His gilded cage was not just his palaces, but his own enormous, decaying body, a prison of flesh from which there was no escape. The physical decay that consumed Henry VIII in his later years was not a solitary torment. It was often accompanied, and perhaps exacerbated by, a noticeable and terrifying decline in his mental and emotional state. As you, the observer, navigate the tense atmosphere of the Tudor court, you witness the shocking secret of a once brilliant, if often ruthless, mind succumbing to fits of uncontrollable rage, deepening paranoia, and an obsessive fear of betrayal. The medical hardship was not just of the body, but of a spirit increasingly plagued by its own dark shadows. Contemporary accounts and ambassadorial reports from the 1540s paint a picture of a king who became notoriously unpredictable and terrifyingly volatile. His famous temper, always a formidable aspect of his personality, seemed to worsen with his declining health and constant pain. You can imagine courtiers treading on eggshells, a misplaced word or an unintentional slight potentially provoking a furious outburst from the ailing monarch. These rages were not just fleeting moments of anger, they could be sustained, terrifying displays of royal wrath, often directed at those closest to him, his wives, his counselors, his servants. The very air in the court would crackle with fear when the king was in one of his black moods. Alongside the rage, a creeping paranoia took root. Henry, who had always been suspicious of rivals and keenly aware of the plots that often swirled around a powerful throne, became increasingly obsessed with imaginary conspiracies. He saw enemies everywhere, even among his most loyal and long-serving companions. This paranoia fueled some of his most tyrannical acts in his later years. You see him, for example, turning against Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister and the architect of much of the English Reformation, ordering his execution in 1540 on charges of treason and heresy that many historians believe were largely fabricated or exaggerated due to court factionalism and the king's own growing distrust. Later, even figures like the Duke of Norfolk and his son Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, men from one of England's most powerful noble families, fell victim to the king's suspicions, with Surrey being executed just days before Henry's own death. The scholarly debate often considers the root of this mental decline. Was it a direct physiological consequence of his jousting accident in 1536? Perhaps a traumatic brain injury that altered his personality? Or was it the result of the chronic, agonizing pain from his leg ulcers, the frustrations of his immobility, and the psychological stress of his many marital failures and political struggles? Some have even speculated about the effects of underlying undiagnosed conditions, or even the cumulative impact of the toxic medicines he was given. One quirky, though entirely speculative theory that occasionally surfaces is the possibility of McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that can cause both physical and neurological deterioration, though there's no definitive evidence for this. What is clear is that the human endurance of those who had to navigate this treacherous court environment, serving a king whose moods were as unpredictable as his health, was immense. An imprudent comment, a misinterpreted glance, a rumor whispered by a rival. Any of these could lead to ruin, imprisonment in the Tower, or a one-way trip to the executioner's block. The shocking secret of Henry's final years is this pervasive atmosphere of terror, a kingdom ruled not just by a physically ailing monarch, but by one whose mind, once sharp and commanding, seemed to be increasingly clouded by suspicion, anger, and a terrifying disconnect from reality. The gilded cage of his body was mirrored by a gilded cage of fear that he himself had constructed around his throne. As Henry VIII's physical and mental health deteriorated throughout the 1540s, the lives of the women who shared his throne became increasingly precarious and unenviable. His later marriages, particularly to Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, were less about statecraft or dynastic ambition, and more about the aging, ailing king's desperate attempts to recapture lost youth, find companionship, or simply secure a dedicated caregiver. You, the observer of this royal soap opera, witnessed the shocking secret of how these queen consorts often functioned more as nurses or even potential victims than as partners to a mighty monarch. First, there was Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, a young, vivacious girl, a cousin of the ill-fated Anne Boleyn. Henry, then in his late 40s and already significantly overweight and plagued by his leg ulcers, was reportedly besotted with his rose without a thorn. He showered her with jewels and affection, perhaps seeing in her youth a reflection of his own lost vigor. You can imagine the grotesque spectacle, the aging, increasingly immobile and foul-smelling king doting on a teenager who was likely both flattered by the attention and terrified by her new role. The medical hardship for Catherine was not her own illness, but the requirement to share the bed and company of a man whose physical state was, by all contemporary accounts, becoming truly repugnant. The inevitable happened. Catherine, young and perhaps foolish, or simply seeking affection and excitement, denied her by her royal husband, engaged in adulterous affairs with members of the court. When these indiscretions were discovered, Henry's wounded pride and paranoia erupted. There was no mercy. Catherine Howard, along with her lovers, was executed for treason in 1542. She was barely out of her teens. Her human endurance was tragically short-lived, a victim of the king's jealousy and the brutal politics of the Tudor court. Then, in 1543, Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. She was a more mature, twice-widowed woman, known for her intelligence, piety, with Protestant leanings, which was dangerous in itself, and, crucially, her skill as a nurse. This marriage was less about passion and more about practicality. You see Catherine Parr not so much as a queen in a romantic sense, but as a dedicated, if wary, caregiver to a grotesquely obese, pain-ridden, and increasingly tyrannical invalid. Her daily life would have involved managing his moods, overseeing his complex and useless medical treatments, and enduring the fetid atmosphere of his sick room. One quirky yet telling detail is that Catherine Parr herself narrowly escaped being arrested and charged with heresy due to her reformist religious views, likely saved only by her quick wit and a carefully managed appeal to the king's ego. The scholarly debate often highlights Catherine's incredible skill in navigating the treacherous currents of Henry's court, not only surviving him, but also playing a role in reconciling him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Her human endurance was of a different kind than Catherine Howard's. It was the endurance of a survivor, a skilled diplomat in a domestic battlefield. The shocking secret of these last queens is that they were, in many ways, prisoners of Henry's decline, their fates inextricably linked to the whims and the decaying body of a man who still held the power of life and death, even as he himself was slowly, agonizingly dying. The winter of 1546 to 1547 descends upon England, cold and bleak, and within the heavily guarded yet increasingly foul-smelling chambers of Whitehall Palace, King Henry VIII, once the robust embodiment of Tudor power, is clearly entering the final stages of his long and agonizing decline. You, the observer, are witness to the last stand of a colossal physique against a relentless siege of maladies, a shocking secret of human frailty played out on a royal stage. The medical hardship is now absolute, the king's body a battleground where death is steadily gaining the upper hand. His leg ulcers, those tormenting weeping sores that have plagued him for over a decade, are now reportedly worse than ever, possibly riddled with gangrene. The stench, which courtiers had long tried to mask with perfumes and strategically held handkerchiefs, is said to be almost unbearable, a miasma of decay that clings to the heavy tapestries and paneled walls of his apartments. His immense obesity, now well over 400 pounds by some estimates, renders him almost completely immobile. He spends his days and nights confined to his bed or his special wheeled chair, his every need attended to by a weary retinue of servants and physicians. The human endurance of these attendants, constantly exposed to the king's suffering, his rages, and the physical unpleasantness of his condition, is a quiet, unsung part of this grim drama. In these final months, Henry is racked by recurrent, raging fevers. These are likely due to septicemia, a systemic blood infection originating from the massive infected ulcers on his legs, or perhaps from other internal ailments. You can imagine the scene: the king, his great bulk trembling with chills, then burning with a consuming heat, his mind often clouded by delirium. His breathing becomes increasingly labored, a harsh, rattling sound that speaks of failing lungs and a struggling heart, both severely strained by his extreme weight and chronic illnesses. There are no oxygen tanks, no respirators, only perhaps the fanning of air by an attendant or the propping up of his massive frame with pillows in a futile attempt to ease his struggle for breath. Witnesses from this period, their accounts filtered through later chronicles, report that during these episodes of delirium, the king often murmured incoherently, sometimes calling out the names of his deceased wives. Jane Seymour, the mother of his only legitimate son, Edward, and the wife he reportedly loved most, and was eventually buried beside, is said to have been a frequent name on his lips. More chillingly, some claimed he also called out for Anne Boleyn, his second queen, the one he sent to the executioner's block on charges many believed to be false. You can almost picture the scene: the once all-powerful king, now helpless and confused, haunted by the ghosts of his past, his conscience perhaps finally catching up with him in the twilight of his consciousness. The scholarly debate around these deathbed utterances is, of course, speculative. Were they genuine expressions of remorse or longing, or merely the disjointed ramblings of a fevered, dying mind? We can never truly know. But the image is potent: a king, stripped of his power and his wits, confronting the specters of those whose lives he had so profoundly and often brutally impacted. The shocking secret of Henry's final illness is not just the catalogue of his physical symptoms, but this glimpse into a mind unraveling, a soul perhaps finally grappling with the weight of its earthly deeds as the body that housed it surrenders, piece by agonizing piece, to the inevitable. As King Henry VIII lay in his opulent chambers at Whitehall during that final grim winter of 1546 to 1547, his body a landscape of grotesque decay, his mind increasingly clouded by fever and delirium, a strange and chilling charade played out around him. You, the observer, witness a shocking secret of the Tudor court. Despite the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of the king's impending demise, the unbearable stench of his gangrenous ulcers, his labored breathing, his near-total immobility, no one, absolutely no one, dared to utter the forbidden word. No one dared to suggest that the king was, in fact, dying. Why this conspiracy of silence, this collective denial in the face of such stark reality? The answer lies in the draconian treason laws of Tudor England, laws that Henry himself had wielded with such terrifying efficiency. Under these laws, it was considered high treason to even predict the king's death. To speak of his demise, to speculate on his successor, or to imply in any way that his reign was drawing to a close, could be interpreted as compassing or imagining the king's death, an offense punishable by a horrific execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, burning for women. The medical hardship here was not for the king, but for the mental fortitude of his physicians and courtiers forced to walk a razor's edge. Imagine the scene. The royal physicians, men like Dr. George Owen and Dr. Thomas Wendy, would attend the king, performing their often useless and painful treatments. They would issue grave but carefully worded bulletins about his indisposition, perhaps speaking of a lingering fever or a reflux of humors. But they would meticulously avoid any prognosis that hinted at fatality. You can picture them, their faces masks of professional concern, acutely aware that a single incautious word could lead them to the Tower of London. They were, in a sense, treating not just a patient, but a ticking time bomb of royal paranoia and legal peril. Courtiers, too, maintained the facade. They would inquire solicitously after the king's health, offer prayers for his recovery, and continue with the elaborate rituals of court life as if his eventual return to vigor was a certainty. All the while, they would be subtly maneuvering, hedging their bets, trying to curry favor with potential successors or powerful factions, but always with an outward display of unwavering loyalty and optimism regarding the king's condition. The air would be thick with unspoken anxieties, whispered rumors, and the constant fear of being overheard or misinterpreted. One quirky yet terrifying detail is that even making arrangements for the succession, a practical necessity given the king's state, had to be done with extreme secrecy and caution. The human endurance required of everyone at court during these final months was immense. To live day in, day out, with the stench of decay, the king's rages, and the oppressive weight of this enforced silence. The gory history is not just Henry's physical state, but the psychological torment and fear that permeated his court. The scholarly debate considers how this atmosphere of denial might have impacted any potential last-minute attempts to genuinely alleviate the king's suffering or to prepare the realm more openly for the transition of power. The shocking secret is this bubble of unreality, where an entire court colluded in pretending that a man clearly rotting away alive was perhaps just a little under the weather. It's a stark illustration of the terror that an absolute monarch, even in his death throes, could inspire. The charade of King Henry VIII's potential recovery, maintained for so long by a terrified court, could not hold indefinitely against the undeniable onslaught of his failing body. By the final days of January 1547, even the most optimistic or fearful observers must have recognized that the end was truly, irrevocably near. You, the witness to these last somber moments, see the carefully constructed pretenses begin to crumble, revealing the raw human reality of a monarch confronting his own mortality. It was likely Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's most trusted Privy Chamber gentlemen and chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, who finally dared to broach the forbidden subject. Seeing the king visibly fading, his breathing shallow, his consciousness drifting, Denny, perhaps at great personal risk, gently informed Henry that his condition was grave and that he should prepare his soul. This act of courage, breaking the unspoken taboo, allowed for the final spiritual preparations to be made. The shocking secret here is the immense bravery it took for anyone to speak this truth to such a formidable and feared ruler, even on his deathbed. Henry, by this point, was reportedly too weak to speak at length, his voice perhaps just a hoarse whisper. When asked which churchman he wished to see, he is said to have murmured the name of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was a key figure in the English Reformation, a man whom Henry, despite his own theological caprices and occasional suspicions, had generally trusted and protected. But Cranmer was not at Whitehall. He was at his episcopal palace in Croydon, some distance away. A messenger was dispatched with urgent haste. You can imagine the tense weight, the king's life ebbing away, while the archbishop journeyed through the cold January night. When Cranmer finally arrived at Whitehall in the late hours of January 27th, or the very early morning of January 28th, Henry was slipping away, his ability to speak apparently gone. The medical hardship of his final hours was compounded by this inability to communicate his last wishes or make his final peace in words. Cranmer, leaning close, spoke to the dying king, urging him to give some sign that he died in the Christian faith. According to the accounts, Henry, unable to articulate a response, reached out and squeezed Cranmer's hand. This simple pressure, this last conscious gesture, was taken as his affirmation of faith. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a life lived with such bombast and world-shattering consequence. Shortly thereafter, in the cold, dark early hours of January 28th, 1547, King Henry VIII, who had reigned for nearly 38 tumultuous years, who had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, married 6 wives, and reshaped the religious and political landscape of England, finally exhaled his last rattling breath. He was 55 years old. The human endurance of his great diseased body had finally reached its limit. One quirky detail often noted by historians is the precise timing of his death. It occurred just after the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, an act many see as one of Henry's final, paranoid assertions of power. The scholarly debate continues on the exact cause of death, given his myriad ailments. Was it septicemia from his ulcers, heart failure, kidney failure, or a combination of all? What is certain is that the once mighty king, the golden prince, the fearsome tyrant, was no more. But the indignities and gory history surrounding his physical remains were shockingly not yet over. King Henry VIII is dead. The news, initially kept secret as per custom, and to allow for a smooth transition of power to his young son, Edward VI, would soon ripple through the court and the kingdom. But for those immediately tasked with the aftermath, a new and horrifying challenge presented itself. Dealing with the colossal, rapidly decaying corpse of the late monarch. You, the observer, are now witness to a shocking secret of royal death, the gruesome, almost insurmountable difficulties of preparing such a body for its final journey, a medical hardship, shifted from the patient to his unfortunate embalmers. Henry's enormous size, a result of years of gluttony and immobility, was the first major problem. He was, by all accounts, a man of immense girth, weighing perhaps 400 pounds or more. His body, already riddled with infection and beginning to putrefy even before his last breath, would now decompose with terrifying speed, especially in the relatively warm, sealed chambers of the palace. The stench, already a notorious feature of his final years, would only intensify, becoming a truly nauseating miasma. The human endurance of those tasked with handling the royal corpse, battling against their own revulsion, and the sheer physical difficulty of manipulating such a heavy, unwieldy mass of flesh is hard to overstate. The process of embalming in the 16th century was, by modern standards, rudimentary and rather brutal. It typically involved evisceration, the removal of the internal organs, heart, liver, intestines, etc., which were often embalmed separately and placed in urns or chests. The body cavities would then be washed, often with wine or spiced solutions, and packed with aromatic herbs, spices, and absorbent materials like sawdust or bran, all in an attempt to slow decay and mask the odor. The body itself might be wrapped tightly in layers of waxed linen or cerecloth. However, performing such a procedure on a corpse as large and as unhealthy as Henry's would have been a horrifying and likely only partially successful endeavor. You can imagine the royal surgeons and apothecaries, their faces perhaps covered with scented cloths, struggling with this grim task, their gory history unfolding in a private, closed room. The scholarly debate sometimes touches upon the specific techniques used on Henry. Were there any special measures taken due to his size or the state of his ulcers? Records are scarce on these intimate details, but it's likely the embalmers faced an unprecedented challenge. The sheer volume of internal fluids, the extent of the putrefaction in his legs, the difficulty of even moving and positioning the body, all would have contributed to a nightmarish scene. One quirky, or rather macabre detail, is that the heart of the monarch was sometimes buried separately, in a different location from the body, though it's unclear if this was the case with Henry. The shocking secret here is the stark, unvarnished reality of what happens to even the most powerful human body after death, especially one so ravaged by disease and excess. The carefully constructed image of royal majesty, of a king almost divine in his authority, crumbles in the face of these basic biological processes. The embalmers, in their grim work, were perhaps the last people to confront the true, unadorned physical state of Henry VIII, a secret kept hidden from the public gaze, but one that underscores the ultimate leveling power of death. Theirs was a task requiring not just skill, such as it was, but an iron stomach and a profound desensitization to the horrors of human decay. With the gruesome and challenging task of embalming Henry VIII's colossal corpse completed, or at least attempted to the best of 16th century abilities, the next pressing issue was its containment. The shocking secret here lies in the sheer scale and complexity of the coffin required for such a monarch, a veritable lead-lined prison designed to manage the unwelcome realities of his advanced state of decomposition and immense size. You, the observer, can almost hear the hammers and saws of the royal carpenters and plumbers working frantically against time and nature. Given Henry's enormous girth and weight, likely exceeding 400 pounds, a standard royal coffin would simply not suffice. A custom-built casket of extraordinary dimensions was necessary. This would have been constructed from heavy, seasoned oak, befitting a king. But more crucially, to contain the odors and the inevitable seepage of bodily fluids from such a large and rapidly putrefying corpse, the coffin needed to be lined with lead. Lead was the material of choice for high-status burials where preservation, or at least containment of decay, was a priority, as it provided a relatively airtight and waterproof seal. You can imagine the royal plumbers carefully cutting and soldering heavy sheets of lead to fit the interior of the massive wooden shell, a painstaking and expensive process. The coffin itself would have been an imposing object, a testament to Henry's physical enormity even in death. Its weight, once occupied by the king's remains and the lead lining, would have been prodigious, requiring numerous strong men to lift and carry. The Medical hardship, in a sense, extended to the logistical challenges posed by the king's body. Every stage, from moving him from his deathbed to the embalming table to the coffin, would have been a feat of engineering and brute strength. Despite these precautions, the embalming, the robust construction, the lead lining, the forces of nature, particularly the gases produced by decomposition within a sealed environment, were formidable. The scholarly debate sometimes considers the effectiveness of 16th century embalming on such a body. While it might have slowed decay to some extent, it could not halt it entirely, especially given Henry's pre-existing infections and the sheer mass of his tissues. The internal pressure from these gases would build within the lead-lined coffin, a ticking time bomb of putrescence. One quirky, or rather deeply ironic detail, is that this elaborate lead-lined coffin, designed to preserve some semblance of royal dignity and contain the horrors of decay, would itself become the focal point of one of the most undignified and gory episodes associated with Henry's death, the infamous incident at Syon Abbey. The very measures taken to ensure a stately and controlled lying in state and funeral procession were about to be spectacularly and grotesquely undone. The shocking secret is that even the strongest coffin, the most meticulous, by contemporary standards, preparations, could not fully imprison the aggressive reality of Henry's decaying flesh. His body, even in death, seemed determined to defy containment, a final macabre assertion of its overwhelming physical presence. The lead-lined prison was strong, but the prisoner within was, in its own way, even stronger. The great lead-lined coffin, now bearing the immense and rapidly decaying remains of King Henry VIII, is finally sealed. The immediate frantic preparations within the confines of Whitehall Palace are complete. Now begins the slow, solemn, and, as it turns out, horrifyingly eventful funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, where Henry had decreed he would be buried in St. George's Chapel alongside his third and most beloved queen, Jane Seymour. You, the observer, join this somber cortege, unaware of the shocking secret that is about to unfold during an overnight stop. The journey, by 16th century standards, is not exceptionally long, about 20 miles, but with such a heavy and prestigious burden, it would be undertaken with deliberate, stately slowness, likely taking a couple of days. The procession itself would be a grand affair, a display of Tudor pomp and circumstance, even in mourning. Imagine a hearse, heavily draped in black velvet, drawn by powerful horses, surrounded by nobles, churchmen, heralds, and a significant military escort. The roads would be lined with subjects, some genuinely grieving, others perhaps merely curious or even relieved at the passing of a tyrannical king. The human endurance of the pallbearers and those managing the heavy hearse over uneven roads would be considerable. The chosen resting place for the first night of this solemn journey is Syon Abbey, located on the banks of the Thames, roughly halfway between London and Windsor. There's a deep, almost gory historical irony to this choice. Syon Abbey had been one of the wealthiest and most prestigious monastic houses in England. However, during his dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, a key part of his break with the Roman Catholic Church and his assertion of royal supremacy, Henry VIII had suppressed Syon Abbey, expelled its Brigittine nuns and monks, and seized its vast wealth and lands for the crown. The community had been particularly resistant to Henry's religious reforms, and some of its members had suffered greatly for their defiance. Now, in a bizarre twist of fate, The body of the very king who had destroyed this sacred institution was to spend a night within its despoiled, perhaps partially ruined, walls. You can almost feel the ghostly disapproval of the displaced monastics. As the funeral procession arrives at Syon Abbey in the late afternoon or early evening, the great coffin is carefully unloaded and borne into the chapel, or what remained of it, to lie in state overnight. Guards are posted. Candles are lit, casting flickering shadows on the cold stone walls. An atmosphere of somber vigil descends. The medical hardship of the journey so far, for the attendants, might have been the ever-present, though hopefully contained, odor, and the constant anxiety about the stability of the massive coffin and its contents. The scholarly debate sometimes considers why Syon Abbey was chosen for this overnight stop. Was it simply a convenient, secure location on the route? Or was there a more symbolic, perhaps even intentionally hubristic element to it? The great king, even in death, resting in a place that represented his triumph over the old religious order? One quirky detail is that Syon Abbey, after its dissolution, had passed into royal hands and was sometimes used by the royal family. Whatever the reason, the shocking secret that was about to be revealed at Syon Abbey would add another layer of infamy and grotesque irony to Henry VIII's already notorious story, turning a solemn overnight vigil into a scene of almost unbelievable horror. The stage is set for the most undignified episode of the king's long journey to his grave. The great lead-lined coffin of Henry VIII rests within the cold, silent chapel of the despoiled Syon Abbey. Night has fallen. Candles flicker, casting long, dancing shadows. Guards stand vigil, perhaps a little uneasy in this place of former monastic devotion, now hosting the remains of the king who had brought about its ruin. And it is here, in the dead of night, that the most grotesque and shocking secret of Henry's journey to the grave erupts. Quite literally. The immense pressure building within the coffin from the gases of decomposition, a consequence of his enormous bulk and the limitations of 16th century embalming, becomes too much for even its robust lead-lined construction to contain. You are there, an unseen observer as the silence of the chapel is shattered. There's a sudden, perhaps sickening sound, a crack, a groan of stressed wood, a tearing of lead. The coffin, inadequately sealed or simply overwhelmed by the internal forces, has burst or sprung a leak. A foul, noxious stench, far more potent than anything experienced before, floods the chapel, a miasma of advanced putrefaction. And then, the truly horrifying part, bodily fluids, the dark, unwholesome products of decomposition from the king's massive decaying corpse begin to seep and trickle from the compromised coffin, pooling onto the cold stone floor of the chapel. Imagine the horror of the guards who witnessed this, or who were assailed by the sudden intensification of the odor. This isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's a catastrophic failure of the solemnities, a profoundly undignified event for a deceased monarch. The medical hardship here is the raw, unvarnished reality of human decay, writ large and royal. All the pomp, all the ceremony, all the attempts to preserve an image of kingly majesty are undone by this simple, brutal biological imperative. The body, even a king's body, will break down, and sometimes it will do so in the most spectacularly grotesque fashion. The scholarly debate, relying on contemporary or near-contemporary accounts, though some are admittedly hostile to Henry, like those of the Catholic exile William Sanders, later reported by chroniclers like Gilbert Burnet, explores the extent and nature of this leakage. Was it a dramatic bursting, or a more gradual, insidious seeping? The exact details are shrouded in the horrified whispers of the past, but the core event, the leaking of the coffin, is a persistent and widely cited story. It represents the ultimate failure of the embalmer's art and the coffin maker's craft to contain the sheer, overwhelming reality of Henry's physical state. One quirky, or rather profoundly symbolic detail is the location: Syon Abbey, a place Henry had violently suppressed. For those inclined to see divine judgment or poetic justice in historical events, this incident, occurring on what they considered desecrated ground, would have been rich with meaning. The shocking secret is this utter, visceral loss of control, even over one's own remains, for a king who had prided himself on absolute control in life. The lead-lined prison had failed. The grotesque reality of his decaying flesh was now exposed, a horrifying spectacle in the dead of night, paving the way for an even more bizarre and infamous postscript to this already grim story. The grotesque scene in the chapel at Syon Abbey, with King Henry VIII's massive coffin having burst or sprung a leak, its putrid contents seeping onto the stone floor, sets the stage for perhaps the most infamous and shocking secret associated with his death. An episode so bizarre and undignified it feels almost apocryphal, yet it is recorded by chroniclers of the time. As you, the observer, linger in the shadowy, stench-filled chapel through the darkest hours of the night, you are about to witness a scene that fulfills a grim, long-forgotten prophecy. According to these historical accounts, particularly those stemming from writers hostile to Henry and his religious reforms, like Nicholas Sanders, whose work was later cited by Bishop Gilbert Burnet and others, the chapel at Syon was not entirely secure. During the night, stray dogs, perhaps attracted by the overwhelming odor of decomposition emanating from the leaking coffin, managed to find their way into the sacred space. And there, in the flickering candlelight, these animals reportedly began to lick up the dark, cadaveric fluids that had pooled on the chapel floor, the very essence of the deceased king. You recoil in imagined horror at this vision. The once mighty King of England, defender of the faith, supreme head of the Church of England, his bodily remains now being lapped at by common street curs. This gory history detail is made even more potent by its connection to a specific prophecy. Years earlier, during the height of Henry's suppression of the monasteries and his disputes with those who remained loyal to the Pope, a brave, or foolhardy, observant Franciscan friar named William Peto, or Peto, had reportedly preached a sermon directly in Henry's presence, denouncing the king's actions and comparing him to the wicked King Ahab from the Old Testament. Friar Peto, with astonishing boldness, is said to have prophesied that, just as dogs had licked the blood of Ahab, so too would dogs lick Henry's blood. At the time, such a prophecy against an absolute monarch like Henry would have been seen as treasonous and wildly improbable. Yet now, in the desecrated chapel of Syon Abbey, it seemed to be coming to a horrifying, literal fulfillment. The scholarly debate around this specific incident is, understandably, quite active. How much of it is unvarnished truth, and how much is embellishment or even fabrication by Henry's Catholic detractors, eager to cast his end in the most ignominious light possible, as a sign of divine retribution? While the core event of the coffin leaking is generally considered plausible given Henry's physical state and the embalming coffining limitations of the era, the detail about the dogs is more contentious. However, its persistence in historical narratives, even if viewed with some skepticism by stricter historians, speaks to its power as a symbolic representation of Henry's ultimate degradation. The medical hardship here is posthumous, a final violation of the body. One quirky yet deeply unsettling thought. If true, what became of those dogs? The human endurance in this part of the story shifts to those who discovered the scene the next morning. The horror, the frantic efforts to clean up, to reseal the coffin, and to ensure this scandalous secret did not spread too widely. The shocking secret of the licking dogs at Syon Abbey, whether entirely factual or a potent piece of historical propaganda, serves as the ultimate symbol of Henry VIII's grotesque end. A king whose earthly power could not save his remains from the most profound and public humiliation, seemingly fulfilling a damning prophecy in a manner that even his worst enemies might not have dared to imagine. The first pale light of dawn on January 30th, 1547, filters into the chapel at Syon Abbey, revealing the horrifying aftermath of the night's events. You, the unseen observer, can only imagine the scene that greeted the royal attendants and guards. The great lead-lined coffin of King Henry VIII, visibly compromised, its seals broken or seams burst, and the undeniable ghastly evidence of leakage on the chapel floor. Perhaps even the lingering presence of the dogs that had desecrated the scene. The shocking secret is out, at least to this inner circle, and a frantic, hushed effort to manage the disaster ensues. Panic must have been the immediate reaction. This was not just an unfortunate accident. It was a scandalous, almost sacrilegious defilement of a royal corpse, an event that, if widely known, could tarnish the solemnity of the entire funeral proceedings, and perhaps even be seen as a dark omen for the reign of his young son, Edward VI. The human endurance of the officials present is tested as they confront this grotesque reality and the urgent need for a cover-up, or at least a very hasty and discreet repair. You can picture them, their faces pale with horror and apprehension, working quickly in the cold morning light. Plumbers, carpenters, or other craftsmen accompanying the funeral procession, or perhaps hastily summoned from nearby, would have been tasked with the unenviable job of attempting to reseal the massive coffin. This would involve working with heavy lead, trying to patch any leaks or reinforce the structure, all while battling the overwhelming stench of advanced decomposition and the knowledge of what had occurred just hours before. The medical hardship is for those undertaking this grim task, exposed to the effluvia and the sheer unpleasantness of dealing with a body in such a state. Their primary goal would be to make the coffin physically sound enough to complete the journey to Windsor and to contain its contents, at least temporarily, through the remaining ceremonies. The scholarly debate might consider how effectively such repairs could have been made under the circumstances. Could they truly have rendered the coffin airtight again? Or was it more of a cosmetic fix, a desperate attempt to prevent further immediate leakage and to get the royal remains to their final resting place as quickly and with as little further incident as possible? One quirky, though grim, detail is the sheer weight of the coffin, which would have made any significant repairs or adjustments incredibly difficult without specialized lifting equipment. Once the hasty repairs were completed, and the chapel floor presumably scrubbed clean of its horrifying stains, the somber procession would have been reformed. You see the coffin, perhaps now even more heavily draped or perfumed to mask any lingering evidence of the night's disaster, being carefully reloaded onto its hearse. The mood among those in the know must have been one of profound unease and a desperate hope that no further indignities would befall their late king. The journey to Windsor, the final leg, would have been undertaken with a heightened sense of anxiety and a grim determination to see the proceedings through. The shocking secret of Syon Abbey was now a shared burden among a select few, a dark tale that would eventually find its way into the more hostile chronicles of Henry's reign, a testament to the fact that even in death, the defender of the faith was not safe from the most profound and earthly corruptions. The gilded cage of majesty was proving to be a very fragile prison indeed against the relentless power of decay. Despite the horrifying and undignified, shocking secret of the leaking coffin and the lapping dogs at Syon Abbey, the funeral procession of King Henry VIII finally reaches its destination. The magnificent St. George's Chapel within the formidable walls of Windsor Castle. It is now mid-February 1547, nearly 3 weeks after the king's death. You, the observer, witness the stark contrast between the grotesque realities of Henry's physical decay and the immense, solemn pomp and ceremony that marked his final interment. This was, after all, the burial of one of England's most powerful and transformative monarchs, and appearances, however deceptive, had to be maintained. Imagine the scene. St. George's Chapel, a masterpiece of perpendicular Gothic architecture, is heavily draped in black mourning cloth. Hundreds of flickering candles cast an imposing, if somber, glow. The chapel is filled with the highest-ranking nobles, clergy, and officials of the realm, their faces grave, their attire suitably funereal. The air is thick with the scent of incense, perhaps a deliberate attempt to overpower any lingering, less pleasant odors emanating from the now heavily repaired and resealed royal coffin. The human endurance here is that of the attendees participating in lengthy, elaborate rituals, while perhaps privately harboring knowledge or rumors of the preceding night's horrors. The coffin itself, enormous and lead-lined, is borne into the chapel with great solemnity and effort by a team of strong pallbearers, likely yeomen of the guard. It is placed upon a grand catafalque, a raised, decorated platform where it will lie in state. The heralds proclaim the king's many titles. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had attended Henry's deathbed, likely presides over the intricate religious rites, masses, dirges, prayers for the soul of the departed king. You hear the soaring, melancholic sounds of the choir, singing Latin requiems. It's a spectacle designed to impress upon all present the majesty of the Tudor monarchy and the significance of this historical moment. The medical hardship of Henry's final illness and the subsequent challenges of dealing with his corpse are now, at least outwardly, subsumed by the grandeur of royal funereal tradition. The scholarly debate might consider how much the average attendee knew or suspected about the true state of the king's remains. Whispers and rumors undoubtedly circulated, but in the highly controlled environment of a state funeral, such things would not be openly acknowledged. One quirky detail is that Henry himself had meticulously planned many aspects of his own funeral and burial arrangements years in advance, envisioning a magnificent tomb that was, in fact, never fully completed to his original grand design. He had decreed that he be buried alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the mother of his longed-for male heir, Edward VI. This wish, at least, was fulfilled. The actual interment takes place in a vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel. The massive coffin is carefully lowered into its final resting place. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The pronouncements are made, the final prayers offered. The shocking secret of the leaking coffin and the dogs of Syon, though perhaps known to some, is now officially sealed away with the king's remains. The public narrative, the one that would be recorded in the more sanitized official chronicles, is one of a mighty king laid to rest with all the honor and ceremony befitting his station. Yet for those who knew the fuller, more grotesque truth, the magnificent rituals at Windsor must have felt like a thin velvet pall draped over a far more horrifying reality. The great king was buried, but the stories of his undignified end would outlive the stone and lead that encased his decaying flesh. King Henry VIII, the Colossus of Tudor England, now lies interred within his lead-lined coffin in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The elaborate funeral rites are concluded, the incense has faded, and the kingdom, now under the rule of his young son, Edward VI, begins to navigate a future without its most dominant and formidable figure. As you, the observer, reflect on Henry's life and truly grotesque death, a series of profound and often shocking ironies concerning his legacy and his desperate quest for dynastic security begin to crystallize. The central driving force behind many of Henry's most controversial and world-altering actions, the break with the Roman Catholic Church, the dissolution of the monasteries, the execution of two of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and countless advisors and nobles, was his obsessive desire to secure a legitimate male heir to continue the Tudor dynasty and prevent a return to the dynastic strife of the Wars of the Roses. You recall his jubilation at the birth of Prince Edward by Jane Seymour, the son for whom he had overturned centuries of religious tradition and risked international condemnation. This son was his ultimate hope, the guarantor of his lineage. Yet the first great irony, this much-desired male heir, Edward VI, whose existence had cost so much upheaval and bloodshed, was himself a sickly youth. He ascended the throne as a boy of 9 and reigned for only 6 brief years, dying of illness, likely tuberculosis or bronchopneumonia, at the tender age of 15 in 1553. The medical hardship that had plagued Henry seemed in a different form to curse his son as well. All of Henry's earth-shattering efforts to secure a strong, lasting male line ultimately proved fragile and short-lived. His dynasty, in the direct male line, would end with his son. The second, and perhaps even more profound, irony lies in who ultimately secured and defined the Tudor legacy. After Edward's brief reign and the tumultuous, bloody interlude of Mary I, Henry's staunchly Catholic daughter by Catherine of Aragon, who desperately tried to reverse her father's Protestant Reformation, the throne passed to Henry's other daughter, Elizabeth I, the child of Anne Boleyn, the very wife he had accused of treason and sent to the executioner's block in his desperate pursuit of a son by another woman. It was Elizabeth, a woman and the daughter of a queen he had destroyed, who would go on to rule for over 4 decades, presiding over one of England's most celebrated golden ages, a period of relative stability, cultural flourishing, and rising international power. The human endurance of Elizabeth, navigating her own perilous path to the throne and then ruling with such skill, stands in stark contrast to her father's chaotic later years. One quirky detail often noted by historians is that Henry, in his will, had reinstated both Mary and Elizabeth in the line of succession, albeit after Edward. Perhaps in his final years, a glimmer of pragmatism or even a belated sense of paternal responsibility led him to this decision, which would prove so crucial for England's future. The scholarly debate continues on Henry's true motivations and the depth of his foresight, or lack thereof. The shocking secret, in terms of his legacy, is how utterly his carefully laid plans for a male-dominated Tudor succession unraveled, and how his most lasting and positive impact on England's destiny came not through his son, but through the daughter of the wife he had so ruthlessly discarded. The echoes of his reign, his religious revolution, and even the consequences of his grotesque death would shape England for centuries, often in ways he could never have intended or imagined. Our long, often unsettling journey through the final years and grotesque death of King Henry VIII has reached its conclusion. You have witnessed the dramatic, almost unbelievable transformation of a golden prince into an obese, pain-racked, and paranoid tyrant. You've peered into the secrets of his fetid leg ulcers, the often harmful medical treatments he endured, the sheer indignity of his physical decline, and the horrifying, bizarre details surrounding his death and its immediate aftermath. The leaking coffin, the lapping dogs, a grim fulfillment of prophecy. It's a stark, unflinching look at the gory history and medical hardship that can afflict even the most powerful. The shocking secrets are many, but perhaps the most profound is the ultimate leveling power of death and decay. Henry VIII, a king who wielded absolute power, who defied the Pope, reshaped a nation's religion, and sent countless souls to their doom with a word or a signature, was, in the end, utterly powerless against the corruption of his own flesh. His immense bulk, once a symbol of his appetites and perhaps his vitality, became a grotesque prison, his majesty and authority unable to halt the relentless advance of disease and putrefaction. The man who considered himself England's supreme head, both politically and spiritually, ended as a leaking, stinking mass of decomposing tissue, a horrifying testament to human fragility. The human endurance in this story is multifaceted. Henry's own endurance of years of chronic pain and debilitating illness, however much his own lifestyle contributed to it. The endurance of his wives and courtiers who had to navigate his rages and the oppressive atmosphere of his declining court. And even the grim endurance of those tasked with handling his enormous decaying corpse. It's a narrative that reminds us that behind the grand tapestries of power and statecraft, the fundamental, often brutal realities of human biology always hold sway. As you now prepare to let these vivid, perhaps disturbing images of Tudor England fade from your mind, as the scent of incense and decay gives way to the clean air of your own quiet room, remember the core purpose of our journey. It is not to revel in the macabre for its own sake, but to understand history in its unvarnished, often uncomfortable truth, and to do so in a way that ultimately allows your mind to unwind, to find a strange sort of peace in the contemplation of these long-past struggles. The suffering of Henry VIII, however self-inflicted some of it may have been, is over. His earthly torments ceased nearly 5 centuries ago. What remains is his complex, controversial legacy and the enduring universal truth that death is the great equalizer, claiming kings and commoners alike. Let that thought in its own way be a comforting one. The dramas, the pains, the ambitions of that distant era are now just whispers in the vastness of time. Allow the silence of your room, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, to draw you away from the 16th century and into the welcoming embrace of sleep. There are no more leaking coffins tonight, no more spectral dogs, only the promise of a deep, untroubled, and restorative rest.